Hello and welcome to ETCIO. Today we have with us a very special guest who has worked with small and medium enterprises across the world and has been trying to strengthen their IT security posture. So join me in welcoming Josh Bregman, who's the COO at Cyglass. Welcome, Josh.
Varun, thanks for having me.
Josh, Gartner defines four different phases of a crisis. Now we've gone through phase one, and we're actually moving into phase two that entails spending cuts, even when cyber threats are getting worse. And that becomes all the more challenging for SMEs who are already facing funding challenges. So, what kind of security threats would that entail? Overall challenges, if you can talk about.
So Varun, I think we can all agree that 2020 has been a very challenging year. From a IT security perspective, the virus has really um, it's been very challenging. The budgets for SMEs from an IT perspective have been decimated. It's been very hard on staff. In many parts of the world, cybersecurity staff has been furloughed. So you've got fewer people. Um, the virus itself has created opportunities for hackers and fraudsters. There have been a set of phishing attacks around COVID scams, free COVID testing, which are all just ways to get credentials and compromise networks. I think also the operating environment has changed dramatically. So in many cases, when the virus hit, VPN infrastructures were thrown up very quickly, or companies accelerated to the cloud. And so all of this happened incredibly fast. And so now the attack surface has radically changed. And cybersecurity professionals who are already stressed with smaller budgets now need to go figure out how to keep that new, dramatically different environment safe. Again, all under the sort of budgetary constraints and uncertainty of the pandemic moving forward.
Absolutely, and it's also a big learning curve for most SMEs. What do you think should be the key learnings that they should focus on when coming out of this pandemic and looking towards a new normal?
Yeah. So I think it's really a sort of back to basics thing. So if you think about what SMEs need to do, they need to see the risks that are on their network. They need to stop those risks that evolve into threats, and they ultimately need to like prove compliance, right? Keep the business running. And so I think through that lens, we need to look at this sort of existing IT setup, the existing tools, and figure out like how are we going to go build an operationally efficient and resilient environment, given the fact that this is going to be dynamic, right? The ransomware a few years ago was not really a thing, and now it's the most urgent threat to companies. And so this thing is going to be changing, and so you need to sort of accept the fact that it will be a dynamic environment. You need to work on building resiliency into your network, into your people and your processes, and just kind of accept that it's going to be like this, unfortunately, for some period of time. But yet the business has to continue, and so we have to sort of make plans, make investments. That sort of standing still, though sometimes it might feel like the right thing to do, probably isn't what's ultimately going to keep you safe going forward. So just trying to be resilient in the face of the new normal is really, I think, I know it's hard, but it's something that I think is imperative for small and medium enterprises.
Absolutely, and as you talk about adapting to the new normal, one of the things that we've seen is a massive acceleration in cloud adoption in the past 1 year since people started working remotely.
Right.
Most organizations have found that to be convenient. However, that also opens up more attack surfaces for
Yeah.
enterprise. And with dissolving parameter, what new elements of security challenges do you think SMEs have to deal with now?
Yeah. So I think at least what we saw in many places is that cloud adoption, particularly cloud adoption, particularly around like office productivity, like Office 365, um, just exploded this year. And so again, there's a set of security controls that were maybe in your on-premise network, behind the firewall that may not be there in some of these applications. And so um, we need to sort of look at what we're actually doing in those SaaS applications. What sort of is there critical information there or not critical information? Um, just and making sure that we're keeping that environment safe. Some basic things like two-factor authentication in those cloud environments will actually go a long way to keeping you to broadly keeping you safe. But you still have to be vigilant and watching what's going on there. In some sense, monitoring what's going on in the cloud is actually easier because there's kind of built to sort of get that information and take a look at it. But that having been said, there's now more information than ever for security professionals to sort of look at, to analyze and understand. If recently in the States, there's been a breach, the SolarWinds attack, a very sophisticated attack. And one of the things that came out in that attack is not unique there is that even multi-factor authentication can be compromised, right, by motivated attackers or social engineering attacks, like at Twitter. So multi-factor authentication. I mean, it is an important thing to do, but the thing to understand is just setting up a protective control like multi-factor authentication in a cloud environment is not enough. You still need to be watching what's going on in those environments and looking for unusual activity, misconfigurations, anomalies, so that you can keep those things, those new environments safe.
Interesting, you talk about the new set of vulnerabilities, especially that can break into multi-factor authentication. One of the things that most organizations look at in a remote environment is deploying VPN, and it just looks like a quick fix for a remote work environment. Now, VPN also comes with its own set of vulnerabilities. How can in this scenario SMEs secure themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're right when the pandemic hit over the summer and through the fall. I mean, there were hackers out on the internet actively scanning for VPNs. RDP, which is a Windows protocol, is often deployed unsecure on the on the internet, and so these were sort of low-hanging fruit. A lot, people, when they sort of think about malware, often think that the initial entry into the network is through phishing, but actually research shows that a lot of it has been over VPNs and unsecured, RDP. And so the first thing there to do is obviously patch, right? If you have known vulnerabilities in your VPN, which there are a number of them that you need to sort of patch and be up to date, it just leaves you sort of less susceptible. But ultimately, people can be compromised, credentials can be compromised, and then from the VPN, you get access to the heart of the network, and that's why VPNs are great. They've been around for a long time. They're very reliable. They do work, but they do need to be monitored and watched more than ever, right? So what governments have been saying is that you need to monitor your VPNs for anomalous activity. What does anomalous activity really mean? So this is someone logging in at a strange time, someone logging in at a strange place, someone performing things they wouldn't normally. Now, this is a sort of easier said than done in the time of the pandemic, because what is a strange time when you're working from home? What is a strange place when Varun, I think you said you're now at your parents' house, instead of from your normal office. So is that weird? Right? So it's not just a simple kind of rule. It's really learning what's going on there, monitoring it over time, and then spotting anomalies. And so again, these VPNs were thrown up sort of hastily, and I know that it's challenging, but really understanding what's going on there is actually critical, as they're now being used in different ways. One other thing, one of the things to sort of be thinking about there with VPNs is that proper policies and procedures need to be followed. It's not uncommon to have people on the VPN and then maybe going to Netflix and doing social media things, because we're all people. But the reality is those are scarce resources from the company, and if the VPN servers are only so big and people are going to Netflix and things like that, then other critical assets can't be accessed. So it's great that they're there. It's great that people are able to spin them up, but they do need to be monitored and watched with renewed scrutiny, given the way that things have been this sort of past year.
Well, that's a great point. I mean, if everyone starts watching Netflix through VPN, I mean, we can only imagine how quickly it's going to get
Yep.
clogged. And that brings me to the next important question is about how do SMEs really figure out if something bad is lurking around?
The biggest advantage that defenders have against attackers is that you know what your network looks like, what your company looks like. You know what normal. You should learn, should I say, what normal looks like. You need to understand who's supposed to be there, who's not supposed to be there, what systems talk to what other systems, what are the sort of critical assets on your network, and put a particular focus on understanding what normal looks like. If you do that, then regardless of how someone gets behind your firewall, whether it's through a phishing attack or an unsecured remote endpoint, understand that when they get on your network, they don't know where to go. I mean, they know where they're headed, which is almost always if it's a Windows environment, the domain controller, but they don't necessarily know how to get there. And so during that sort of initial reconnaissance phase, they'll be noisy on the network. Sort of think of when you break into a building, you may have seen the plans, but you don't really know where you're going. So if you're actually watching where the person is going, it's sort of like they would basically be like knocking on every door and being like, hey, is there anything here? Is there anything here? And so from a network perspective, if you're watching for that stuff, you see that knocking, and you can find it sooner rather than later. I mean, so particularly around critical systems and privileged users, monitoring what's going on, what they're looking at, is really the best way to find something as they're sort of knocking, so they're kicking around. So understanding what baseline is, understanding what's normal, and looking for deviations is really the most reliable way to detect somebody who's gotten past your perimeter controls.
I think one of the things that a lot of organizations say is that they've never been breached or attacked, and if that's the case, most likely they're not even aware of the attacks they're already facing.
In many cases, even for something like ransomware, people have been on the network for 15 days, 30 days, 60 days. I mean, they're there for a long time, right? I mean, so there's ample opportunity prior to something bad happen to see them if you're looking. I think unfortunately, this has been a really hard problem for SMEs because, again, limited staff, limited budget, a lot of sort of detective controls, the sort of false positives are become the sort of bane of their existence. So you're constantly being bombarded with alerts, and human nature just says, listen, I can't really pay attention to that. So I think it's incumbent upon defenders the key there is to really understand which things are important, right? So if there's an alert just in some random system, it's probably not that important. If it's a CEO's laptop, like that's important. If it's your critical ERP system, that's important. And so if you're, it's really about having an understanding, a sort of a risk-based view of your network, understanding which things are actually critical. If you think about keeping yourself safe from a ransomware attack, part of the reason why ransomware is effective is because critical assets, things that you're willing to pay money to get back, have been captured and compromised. So working backwards from that, understand which things, you'd be willing to pay money to get back, and make sure that you've got those things not only safe and secure, but you're monitoring them, more actively and more closely.
I think a lot of focus has gone into prevention of attacks, but a very basic question that SMEs sometimes have to deal with is once they are hit by a cyber attack, how do they actually respond, and where do they even start? So, a very basic question, just your views on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is this is really all about planning, right? This is all about prior to the bad thing happen, to have built a responsible, an incident response plan, to have practiced that incident response plan, not every day, but every quarter, every 6 months, whatever, so that people know what to do if the bad thing happens. Because it'll be very hard during the crisis if you don't have a plan to know what to do. And then a part of that is sort of identifying the affected systems, isolating the affected systems, and then restoring them to operational normal. There's sort of like there's a 1, 2, 3 there, and just sometimes the prevention can be worse. The cure can be worse than the disease. So just understanding again, why this thing has happened, who has done it, and sort of how to respond proportionally and effectively, all through a sort of risk management and business continuity lens is really a key. So I know that's a lot. I mean, it might sound like a lot of sophisticated concepts for an SME, but just like basic planning and basic sensible risk management practices prior to something happening is really the best path towards having an effective response to a breach.
Excellent. Now, one of the things that most security professionals are talking about today is moving to a zero trust architecture. Yeah. But when you actually go and talk to SMEs, they think it's more of a futuristic technology and something that would take a lot of money or most of their budget to actually deploy. Yep. What are your thoughts on that?
So zero trust is really about treating the network as hostile and treating the network as untrusted. And look, a lot of that is really about using more cloud services, so using services over the internet, which by definition is a hostile and untrusted environment. But I think for most SME customers, they're in a hybrid environment. They're probably still largely on premise. And I think it's a good reminder that actually your internal network, and even the network of your partners, should not just be summarily trusted, right? So we've got ideas like defense in depth that still apply in zero trust, and that really, as you move to not trusting your network anymore, you still have to monitor, right? I mean, I think that all of these sort of bad things that happen are because once people get behind the firewall, that is the network is trusted, right? And I can roam freely and I can do all these things. And that exposes how far we have to go in that sort of zero trust mindset. But one thing that I think SMEs can do is to sort of do a network risk assessment to understand everything that's supposed to be on the network, understand the users, devices, and services, and then sort of monitor for sort of threats and anomalies. Ultimately, what companies need to do is they need to be able to see threats to their network. They need to see risks. They need to be able to stop the threats, and they need to be able to prove compliance if they're regulated. And it's a challenge in sort of any environment. And those sort of core principles are still going to be the sort of guiding direction as companies make the transition to zero trust, over time.
So basically, know your basics, get the basics right. And
yeah, I mean, it sounds all like it sounds really boring, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of this stuff. A lot of this stuff is 101. And what I would say is, a lot of times attackers go after small, medium enterprises because they are low hanging fruit. They don't have the resources. They don't have the sophisticated tools. They maybe don't have the team. And so if you can just not make yourself an easy target, patch your systems, look for, things that are going on the internet that shouldn't go on the internet, just like some basic stuff, have a plan. You're a lot less likely to become a victim of these things because, criminals are, they're ruthless and they're efficient. And if they, don't see these things, then you're not going to be an easy target. So, it's just like a sort of back to basics, get your sort of IT security house in order, get your asset inventory is probably the best advice that I can give SMEs in keeping themselves safe in this new normal. And then, sadly in the, we really all hope that 2021 is going to be better. We're all sort of fingers crossed as we get to the end of the year, but I think that it's going to be a challenge going forward. But I think if you sort of, get back to basics, to, what you can do to sort of stay safe in 2021.
Thanks so much for that perspective, George. And like you said, security is a journey, and even if you expect the best to come, you have to be prepared for the worst. So
absolutely,
thanks so much for joining in. Take care.
Yeah, Varun, thanks so much for having me. Have a happy holidays and happy new year.
You too. Bye bye.
All right. Bye-bye.